Namibia is full of amazing people, whether local or visiting. Join us for the conversation where we discuss these incredible projects, interesting topics, and what makes Namibia so special. So today, I feel like a lucky small boy sitting next to an elder to pick his brain in terms of the philosophy of the times in which we live. I'm so lucky to welcome to the conversation Prof. Pisani, a legend in the Namibian society, in my opinion. And knowing Prof. Andre, yes, we will try to pick his brain, but we will probably more pick his heart. Prof. Andre, you are always so kind with your time towards us at Gondwana. So once again, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us. In times that is so interesting, in the history of our country, and we need the guidance of, like I said, elders and philosophers like yourself. But before we dive into the deep end, maybe some context. Tell us about Andre Pisani and your life and your story.
Gys, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a singular pleasure to have a conversation that has quality to it. I am born in Namibia. I'm a Namibian by birth, but by inclination I'm a citizen of the world. I try to live a life that is ethical, and I try to live the philosophical life, which doesn't mean that you have to be a professor to be a philosopher. That doesn't mean that at all. What it does mean is that you value the quality of ideas, you interrogate ideas, they shape you, you shape the ideas, and you transmit them through a conversation with others. Because philosophy is a conversation about ethics, about values, about the future, about the present, about what makes us innately human. And I think the foundation of it is very important to emphasize, and I'd like to just emphasize that. In philosophical terms, whether you look at it from African philosophy or Oriental philosophy or the Western canon of philosophy, it doesn't really matter. But the fundamental assumption of philosophy is firstly that we are moral agents. We are moral agents, meaning that we are capable of acting morally. It does not mean that we always act morally, far from it. We are very devious, and we often don't act morally, but we are intrinsically, innately capable of moral action, moral agents, and moral agency. That's the first assumption in all philosophies. And the second assumption in all philosophies is that we have reason, we have intellect, we can discuss, we can, through a process of public and private deliberation, we can find truth. We can derive at a higher level of understanding. We can define for ourselves empathy. We can prod the contours and the value of the imagination through a public dialogue. So to be a philosopher really means to have the moral imagination and to have the emphatic imagination. In other words, the ability to put yourself in the shoes of others, not just yourself, not to be self-centered, not to be hedonistic about yourself and about your own privilege and your own advantage, but to be relational in relation to those who don't have what you have. And that's why if you live the philosophical life, you are concerned about the weakest members of your society. If you cannot address the weakest, the most vulnerable, the most marginal, you have failed morally. And that's a principle, I think, that we need to understand in politics as well. It's not about simply just promoting the interest of the haves, or the majority even. It is about responding morally and ethically to the needs of the most vulnerable in your society. If you can't do that, you have failed morally and you have failed ethically. So I'm a product of Namibia, I'm a product of Africa. I have been to 25 African countries. I've traveled extensively in Africa. I still try to do that. And I believe that Africa is particularly important from the perspective of moral philosophy and ethics, for reasons that I'd like to explain.
Let's dive in there. Is it about the opportunity to look at the collective instead of the me? What is it that intrigues you and that makes you feel that is an important aspect, the African context?
First of all, I think, that we generally undervalue the legacies and the lineage of African moral philosophy. Very few people engage systematically with African ethics. Ethics is just a short term for a branch of moral philosophy. Very few people engage with the depth of African philosophy and African morality and African ethics. And why is that? That's first of all because somehow we undervalue what we have as Africans. We tend to borrow and incorporate ideas from outside because we think that makes us grand, that makes us intellectual, that makes us civilized, that makes us, educated. But the foundation of African philosophy is the relational concept that your humanity is interlinked and dependent on the humanity of the other, and that your humanity exists with the humanity of others and through the humanity and the friendship of others. And that there is connection, not only socially and relationally, but there is a connection to the other outside your community. So the sense of community, the sense of identity, the sense of belonging. And that's why African philosophy and African ethics is really a form of cultural inquiry. So it locates ethics centrally where it should be, and that is within a cultural framing. That's why African philosophy is at one level complex, but at another level fundamentally important. It's not simply an abstraction like some of the Western canon of ethical ideas outside an ahistorical context or a communal context. African philosophy is philosophy in context, and it is philosophy based on the fundamental assumption not only that we are moral agents and that we have moral agency, but that our identity and our existence and our substance, to use a philosophical term, is codependent on the substance and the identity and the interaction of the other.
Well, that is
the fundamental value of African philosophy, and that is what the world has lost.
And it is so beautiful, and that to me makes it also most sustainable, because
Yes.
It's not only about me, it's about us. But you've said something that is a recurring theme in the conversations that we have with exceptional Namibians and Africans like yourself. Why do we suffer from that insecurity or lack of confidence? Why do we think? And of course, some of the outside is very good. It's maybe even better.
Yes.
But why do we long first for the outside? Why do we think all of that is better and that we must bring all of that in here and disregard what we have?
I think I'll give a philosophical answer, but also a partly historical answer. Philosophically, as I said, the problem is that the curricula of philosophy, also at universities, particularly at higher institutions like universities, the curricula of philosophy tends basically to marginalize philosophies from other origins. In other words, that we tend to emphasize Western, the classical canon, the pre-Socratic, Socratic philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, the contractarian philosophy tradition, which is very critical in Western political thinking and is fundamental in the construct of constitutionalism and so on. But we then marginalize African philosophies and African ethics. So there is actually a reason, a very important reason why that is the case. That's one reason. The other reason, which is much more important, is the impact collectively over time of colonization and foreign dominance over Africa, where the quality of Africa and the substance of the African person and African personhood was not valued. Let me give you illustrations. First of all, if we look at the development of international law as a discipline, the fundamental assumption of international law, and you can go back to Grotius, you can go back to all the foundational texts of modern international law, whether they be French or whether they Dutch or British, you can go back to all of them. Africa was regarded to be outside the domain of the civilized. International law was devised as a Western construct fundamentally to regulate interstate relations, excluding non-Western societies. That's the philosophical foundation of colonialism. That is why in our own case, in the Namibian case, we had genocide, because the African subject was not regarded to be of equal quality to the Western subject. In fact, was regarded to be outside the domain, outside the moral domain of being civilized. So that is the fundamental anchor of all forms of colonialism. The idea of higher cultures and lower cultures, the idea that some are in and others are out, and that the other, the African in this case, is not equal to the European or to the American or to the civilized world, outside the domain of the civilized world. And if you read the text at the time, and if you look at even the fundamental formulations of international law, including laws on genocide and the laws of war, it was always like that. In South Africa, for example, until the 19th century, you could legally hunt the San people because they were regarded as vermin. They were defined as animals. Of course, we are animals, we know that biologically, but they were not regarded as human and as sufficiently civilized to qualify under the precepts of international law. So the explanation is both in terms of contemporary curricula around philosophy, ethical traditions, ethical philosophy in universities, but it's also a much older tradition. And that older tradition of colonialism and imperialism and slavery, what did it do fundamentally? It humiliated the African being. It humiliated the African being. And that's the explanation why Africa eventually took up arms to fight colonialism. Because if you humiliate a person, you touch the very fabric, the very essence of that individual. You, as it were, empty that person. You empty that person of meaning. You remove meaning from that individual, culturally, in terms of identity and in terms of human agency. And if you look at the history of Africa, for example, that's the explanation why in Africa people took up arms to fight colonialism. And that's why we had liberation struggles, including in this country. Because apartheid was not a form of politics. Why not? Because apartheid was not politics. Why? Because politics is about the art and the practice of associating together. Politics is the art and practice of associating together, building a larger unity, a larger sense of community, a larger sense of belonging, and a larger sense of purpose. It's the art and practice of associating together, politics. That, incidentally, is the definition of Aristotle. And within that art and practice of associating together, both the art and the practice, you then deal with the issues of distribution, who gets what, when, and how. That then becomes how you actualize your politics. But if you don't have the art and practice of associating together, you actually don't have politics. You have apolitics, you are apolitical, you have something else. And apartheid was the art and practice of disassociation. Disassociation, not the art and practice of association. And I think many people don't understand this fundamental truth about apartheid. Fundamentally, apartheid was not only morally a crime, but it was not even good politics, because it was not about the art and practice of associating. So the two reasons are the contemporary curricula of most universities, and secondly, the profound levels of humiliation that Africans suffered, not only through international law, not only through colonialism, slavery, and imperialism, but the fundamental precept that the African personhood was not on par with the personhood of Western societies, and therefore was inferior to the West. And that's why many Africans, even today, find it difficult to go back into themselves, to enter themselves, and to say, what is it that makes us African? Where does our meaning derive from as Africans? Why is it that we need to associate together? And how can we restore the dignity of Africa as a continent and as a people? And that's the dialogue that we must have, and that's why African ethics is fundamentally important.
I find it absolutely fascinating, and all the examples that you used of evil, it's born out of one seed, and that is the seed of I'm more important than you.
Yes.
Of superiority. That was Nazis. That was apartheid. And that is why, on a personal level, I hate the concept of VIP, because that is the seed. I am more important than you. And what you've said in terms of African philosophy is that then surely the VIPs in Namibia are those people who slept in a cold shack last night.
Yes. Yes.
They are most important.
Yes, I agree. But there's another interesting argument which is connected to the previous argument. And if we really conceptualize democracy properly, in a philosophical sense, what is democracy? Democracy is the politics of the ordinary. This is the definition of a very good moral philosopher, John Donne, British. Democracy is the politics of the ordinary, meaning that we should treat people in the same way. We should value people similarly. We should recognize the diverse contributions that people bring to the democratic marketplace of ideas. It's the politics of the ordinary, not the politics of the exceptional, not the politics of the VIP. And that's why we have to start with the most vulnerable in our society. And it's not only Immanuel Kant who made this argument. Many, many philosophers made this argument. John Rawls, for example, in his theory of justice, made the same argument. Do policies actually promote the interest of the most vulnerable or not? Do we address the needs not only of the society, but particularly the needs of the most vulnerable, the most marginal in our society? If we can say yes, then we have a moral foundation to build policy and to provide and respond and to determine who gets what, when and how, and for what reasons. And we derive at this through a process of public deliberation. Immanuel Kant, one of the most profound moral philosophers in any canon of philosophy, developed this idea which he called the categorical imperative. And that simply means in ordinary English that do the right thing, act appropriately and consistently. If you make the right decision, in each context continue to do so. And how do we derive at that? We derive at that through a process of public conversation, public discourse, Amartya Sen, the Indian. If we don't have public discourse and we don't talk about the issues one-on-one, and we don't value the ideas and the interests of others, we can't build a moral community. We study philosophy. I personally believe that the challenge for the world is to reinvent the construct of the moral community. What would make Namibia a moral community? That is the challenge. What would make Namibia a moral community? And it's not a professor of philosophy that can give you the answer. It's the conduct of practical politics, public deliberation. Kant said famously, if you want to know who I am, ask me. If you want to know what I want, ask me. Immanuel Kant, one of the most profound, complex, comprehensive virtue philosophers. It's as simple as that. Ask people, engage people, learn from people, and build together in terms of the art and the practice of associating together as Namibia, as Namibians, as a society. That is the challenge, building the moral community.
But it almost gives me, it's almost a positive, because we live in a time in Namibia, a very exciting time where there is a lot of public discourse.
Yes.
In terms of economic emancipation, in terms of green hydrogen and the risk that comes with that, including environmental risks, oil and gas, in terms of, the environmental risk that comes with that. Yet, the developmental agenda, because our people live in poverty.
Yes.
And there's a lot of discourse and a lot of conversation that's happening on this front, and often on the maybe not but on the ends of, everyone is protecting their perspective, which I think is a good thing, because ultimately somehow the truth is somewhere in the middle in terms of compromise and balance.
Absolutely. I think, Gys, what is very important to emphasize, and I really want to try to be very practical, but also at the same time slightly provocative. Namibia is on the cusp of entering an era potentially of great prosperity, and a lot of good can come out of it. But at the same time, a lot can go wrong. And a lot can go wrong because to enter this and to negotiate and to discuss the benefits of green hydrogen and oil and gas, and who will benefit and whose interests will be looked after, one needs to have two ideas in place right from the inception. First is you need to understand that there has to be justice in the process. Justice means that there have to be general principles which are partly based on law, but partially based on ethical principles, so that you have a framework where you are recognized as an equal partner in a process of dialogue over these new resources, particularly given the asymmetry of the power relations that we face. We are not a big state. We are not particularly strong. We are not exceptionally well endowed in terms of intellectual and technical resources. So we have an asymmetry in power relations. So the ethical principle is, because we are asymmetrical, we are, if you wish, this weaker party in this. The first thing we need to do is we need to recognize we need reinforcement. We need capacity. Capacity. If you look at Sen, Amartya Sen, and I emphasize the Indian philosophers, because they are not only great philosophers, but they work in a society that is profoundly unequal and has some of the most levels of profound corrosive poverty in the world. The first thing that we need to do, if we want to have justice, we need to build capacity so that we can capacitate our own people to engage in a meaningful way with the stronger parties. That's the first thing, capacity constructs of justice. The second thing is we need fairness, because these are negotiations that ultimately crystallize in terms of firm agreements that we enter into with multinational corporations, amongst others, perhaps with other states, and that crystallize later into policy and into regulations. We need structural fairness. We need process fairness. We need outcome fairness. We need to have outcomes that are fair to people, particularly communities that live close to these resources. We need to consider the environment. We need to make sure that there is an outcome that is environmentally sustainable. So the answer to your question lies in these constructs. Do we have a framework that is just? And if we say yes, we have it, have we capacitated Namibia adequately so that Namibia can play its full part as a partner, as a critical partner in the dialogue with others about the resources and their development and their future use? And do we have fairness in a structural sense, in a procedural sense, in an outcome sense? And there is something else, and that is the notion of truth. Do we actually know? Do we have the information to deal with the complexity of these issues? I always say, not only to the students, but I always tell myself this, very practical. Ethics is not an abstract construction. We make ethical decisions on a daily basis. Sometimes we even do that unawares. But the ethical approach to policy is the following. First, we need to ask, whose interests are we responding to? Whose interests? We need to ask, which institutions do we require, or what institutional capacity do we require to manage the policy? That's the second I. We need information. Do we have the information of the policy and for the policy? Do we know enough about, say, green hydrogen? Do we have an adequate basis of information? And is that information verified? Do we know that can guide us? And then we look at the impacts of policy. So if we can answer those 5 I questions, we have a moral foundation to develop policy and regulations. What are the interests that we wish to serve in this domain? What institutions would we require? What information do we need to be able to proceed? What impacts are we looking at? And then there are other I's that you can add on if you want. What inputs would be required, and so forth and so on. But if we have those in place, then we can develop a meaningful bargaining position in relation to those within which we are. Because remember, the relationship from the beginning is asymmetrical. It's not symmetry. It's unequal.
But Prof, when we embark on a path to find the truth, is it not by necessity sometimes that you have to embark on a path to realize that this is not the path.
Yes.
Otherwise, you will not embark on any path.
Yes.
You find the information as you go along.
Yes.
And you uncover risks. And you
Absolutely.
uncover positives and you uncover negatives.
Yes.
And is that not the terrifying part of this journey?
I agree. That's a terrifying part. And also when we talk about truth is a very important construct in philosophy, as we all know. And clearly there isn't one single truth. There is not a universal truth. Even in that sense, Kant was not very helpful with the idea of the categorical imperative and the claim that it's a universal thing. It is often not a universal thing because truth can be competitive and be contested, and is always contested. But we need to have, and I want to use this example. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up in South Africa, under, the aegis of that wonderful leadership that it had, with former Archbishop Tutu and Alex Boraine and others, they asked themselves this fundamental question: what is truth? And the other question, what is justice? And what did they say? And I think we need to remind ourselves of that as Namibians. They said, you can have factual truth. In other words, in philosophy, we would say you can have empirical truth. You can prove it, it's there. Or you can run an experiment or go into a laboratory and do something and say, well, here's the outcome. It's scientific proof, it's empirical truth, it's factual truth. You can have truth through dialogue. Critical, Gys, truth through dialogue. This is the idea of Amartya Sen and others. Talk to people, ask them, establish the facts, establish the history, build it. And you can have restorative truth, restoring and improving and getting an outcome that is socially sustainable. And I think it's very important that in this context that we keep these different denotations or different meanings of truth very clearly in mind. We can have empirical truth where people will say, okay, here's the paper, this is what the seismic studies show, this is what we think could come out of these resources, and so on and so forth. Yes, we need that, obviously. That's foundational. We need that. But we also need truth through dialogue. We need to talk to the people who lost land. We need to talk to the people who've been marginalized. We need to talk to those who may not benefit from these resources. And we also need to make sure that we have restorative truth. In other words, truth that adds value and makes the entire enterprise a sustainable one, both socially and environmentally. And that's the big challenge. That is the big challenge. If we don't go there, and I agree that some of this is through muddling through, trying this, trying that, learning as we go along because we have the capacity to learn. But if we can't answer those questions, then these projects will not ultimately serve the interest of the country.
You've mentioned something in terms of the times that we live in Namibia, and one of and hopefully the ultimate outcome will be prosperity, shared prosperity for our people. But that concept of prosperity,
yes,
we live also in a global world where I think the world's never been richer, more prosperous. Yet we get the impression also that the world's probably never been more unhappy.
Absolutely. And I think it's a very important question. I'm very happy it came up. Because I think, if we focus solely on prosperity, or whether we call it inclusive growth or shared prosperity or whatever we call it, and we know in our discourse in Namibia, those ideas have already found some roots. People talk about that. How do we create inclusive growth? How do we create, shared prosperity? But as important is do we create a happier Namibia? Do we meet the needs of the greatest number in a meaningful way? And as you are aware, there are, apart from prosperity indexes, which tend to be quite quantitative, there are qualitative indexes of happiness. Are we making Namibia a happier place for all its people? And what are we happy about? The Kingdom of Bhutan is the happiest country in the world, the Kingdom of Bhutan. People have a high level of happiness because happiness is a qualitative construct that is not fundamentally based on economics. If we look at Namibia at the moment, we look at the 2024 World Development Report, we will see that in Africa, Namibia's per capita income has dropped. We are number 8 currently. We're amongst the top 10, but we are down $4,450 on average per capita, the income. Now, we can look at that and we can say, okay, perhaps when we have these new developments, these big mega projects, perhaps then, we'll push that up significantly. And that's how many economists are arguing. But would that necessarily translate into a happier Namibians? Would we be a happier society? Would we be at peace? Would we have greater social peace? Not formal peace, that we have, but greater social peace. Would we have greater equity? Would we have greater justice? Would we have more fairness? Because happiness ultimately links into these constructs. And those are the questions that we need to pose and that we need to really find answers for.
And how do we formally incorporate that aspect into policy developing?
Yes, it's not easy, obviously. The first thing I think is that we need to develop a policy culture in Namibia. Policy is a dialogue where you balance your interests, your institutions, your information, your impacts, for example. So we need to develop a policy culture. When we develop policy, we need to be deliberative, we need to talk, we need to explain exactly what the objects of the policy are, why we need policy, what the policy needs to achieve. That's the first thing. We need to build a policy culture.
And sorry to interrupt, but I think we sometimes really get that wrong.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we often fail. The pattern has been, until quite recently, there are exceptions, and I would be the very first one to acknowledge those. But until recently, policy development at the national level or even at the regional level was mostly the work of foreign consultants. Mostly. We spent billions of dollars since independence on people arriving here with laptops, or perhaps I should now say smartphones, and briefcases, if they still have those, and they develop policy. And we broadly copy and paste from other countries. Or we copy and paste from the UN framework and we say, well, this is essentially how Namibian policy will look like and how it will evolve. So we miss the critical first steps of policy, which are, let us sit down, let us answer these I questions, let us engage, let's develop a policy culture where ideas play a role and where people can make inputs and generate their own constructs of the ideas, of the truths, ultimately, that they wish to achieve. And that's the problem in Namibia. That has changed in respect of some policies. Environmental policy, by and large, many Namibian-based consultants or Namibians have made major contributions to environmental policies, sustainable development, gender policy. I must say also in terms of fiscal policy and the management of the fiscus and money laundering and other areas like financial proliferation and so on. Many of us, including myself, have worked tirelessly with government agencies to develop policy. But those are the exceptions. So we need to say, let us step back. Let's take a step back. Let's go out. Let's establish these eyes. Let's see what we wish to achieve. Let us go back to our people. Policies must not only be people-centered, they must also be bio-centered. I want to emphasize that many people say, well, Namibia is an exemplar in the world, and perhaps we are, of a country that by and large manages its environment, its biodiversity relatively well. And many people would agree with that. But the balance is not there. The balance should be, how do we balance social or people-centered policy with environmental or bio-centered policies? How do we bring those two holistically together to make sure that we have a universal policy where we are not damaging the environment, we are not compromising the interests of future generations. We are ensuring that we have sustainable development, both socially and environmentally and in terms of biosustainability. And I think if we can get that right, that policy culture, that policy process, Namibia will advance. And then we will have shared prosperity.
I want to unpack that concept of prosperity more, especially in terms of a business context. And I often struggle with this also, and I ask myself, what is my role in this? Because if you look at the world that we've built from a business world perspective, in terms of regulation and governance, and
yes,
you've mentioned more and more international frameworks and things like that, which I also think is to some extent very, come from a Western perspective. And some of this has led to a lot of narrow-minded prosperity in terms of profitability.
Yes.
But global surveys show that 85% of employees are disengaged.
Yes. Yes.
And I often rebel against these frameworks and these things because I feel so much of it is built on distrust. It's on the 99% have to pay for the 1%.
Yes.
And how do we build something better that really includes sustainability and happiness?
I think the philosophical answer is a long one, and I won't go into all the intricacies of the answer, but it's a very important one. I think that if we look historically at the evolution of ideas, not only in the Western canon, but also in the Occidental canon and in African canon, the fundamental premise was that the foundation of economics and politics is ethics. Ethics is the foundation. You don't have to read Aristotle or Plato or Socrates to know that. Of course, they help if you read them, because that's the point that they make. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. So that's where we need to start. We need to go back and say, who are we? Why are we here? What are our purposes? How can we build the moral community for Namibia? That is the ethical point of departure. And then comes politics. How do we organize society? How do we organize the state? How do we organize the distribution of power and authority in society? That is the politics, who gets what, when, and how. And the economics, how do we make sure that we have a material basis to sustain our society? How do we draw investment? How do we invest in certain areas that are being neglected? How do we make sure that there is a social compact attached to investment? Under what conditions do we accept foreign direct investment? And if we get that right, and that's the big challenge, then I think we are moving to a greater equilibrium, and we would move to what Kant called social peace. And that is the challenge, not only for Namibia, that's a challenge for the whole world. Because at the moment what we have elite empowerment, and some would even say we have cartel empowerment. The connected elites And the network of elites are the ones who are benefiting mostly, not only in terms of contracts and tendering and other areas of policy, but generally they are the ones who really enjoy high qualities of life. And we have built them up, you know. So we need to go back to the basics. And the basics would be, what is the philosophical life? What is the ethical life? How can we get that? How can we truly be human? And how can we be human through the humanity of others? How can we go back to first principles? Because in philosophy, ethics is dealing with first principles. Yes, we have applied ethics, as we know. We have business ethics, we have medical ethics, we have ethics developing about space, we have environmental ethics, all of those, we have them. But the first principle starts with, who are we? If we say we are moral agents, how do we ensure that we act most of the time morally and ethically? So we have to come back, we have to enter ourselves, and then through others enter us, and we build the sense of community and belonging. And if we say we are Namibian, what does it mean? Does it mean, to be provocative, that you drink, you know, Namibian beer, or that you braai Namibian meat? What does it mean to say I'm a Namibian, or I'm an African? What does it mean? Ultimately, it must mean that it is not only what you consume, it must mean that you have a level of consciousness and connectedness with other Africans and other Namibians, and that you are interdependent and codependent, or to use a big word, mutually constitutive with other Namibians. It must mean that. To be Namibian is ultimately a consciousness. To be African is ultimately a consciousness that we belong here, that we have opportunities here, that we have assignments to fulfill, that we can produce here, we can make money if we want to, but also that we can share, we can grow together, we can deepen our collective humanity. That's what it means. So where is that consciousness? And if we look at Namibia, to be very clear about this, if we look at Namibia, for very obvious reasons, when we took independence about 34 years ago in 1990, this was a moral moment. This was the Namibian moment where we became the lodestar of Southern Africa and much of Africa. Even in Zambia and other African countries where I travel quite regularly, they always remind me Namibia was the lodestar. South Africa became a lodestar after 94 with the moral power of the late President Nelson Mandela and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the transition away from apartheid. We also historically were a lodestar. And morally, you can explain that because for the first time, Namibians were recognized, their dignity, their equality, their humanity. We could exercise choice. Ethics is about making social choices. We made the right social choices. We built something here. That we must deepen, that we must expand. We should not stop building. Reconciliation is not one historical moment. Reconciliation is an ongoing social process. It's a process that we have to do each and every day, each and every one of us, in our different capacities and domains. Then I think there is hope for us. So that's where we need to go. And that will create a consciousness that we are truly Namibian and we are truly African and we are ultimately truly human.
I love, it's so beautiful that consciousness coupled with, in a Namibian context, with our interdependence. I can, try to be a very selfish Namibian and, what is in it for me? But the truth is undeniable that I am dependent. We are interdependent.
Absolutely.
On each other. So, as you so beautifully explained, the African philosophy around that, which is in the word that we all know in terms of
Ubuntu, for example, yes.
Yeah. And I hope we have the moral confidence to, in terms of these times that we live in, that we really incorporate that into our canvas.
Yes.
Because we have the opportunity to follow other blueprints.
Yes.
But we also have the opportunity to design our own.
Absolutely. And Ubuntu, that idea that humanity is defined by the humanity of others and the interaction of human people. And as moral agents, we interact together and we build a sense of belonging, a sense of consciousness. And then we keep that alive through sereti. Sereti is the idea, it's like a fire. In Zimbabwe, for example, in the Shona canon of ethics, they have the idea that you milk a cow. In other words, it's the dependence and the interdependence that from the cow comes the milk, and the milk goes into the human person. And the human person and the cow and the milk become an organic unity. And that is the great value. And it's not for nothing that humanity's origin is in Africa. It's not for nothing. Modern man developed in Africa. Africa is the birthplace of humanity. And Africa also, in a very profound sense, is a fundamental birthplace of moral values and ethics. And what I think we need to do is we need to take the best that we have in terms of ideas and practices. That's why I say politics is an art. It's at the level of ideas, but it's also a practice of associating together. And through that association, we build the moral community. And that ultimately is the challenge for every one of us. And if we have the moral community, then we also have the wherewithal to say, look, perhaps we've gone too far, perhaps we've erred, because, we are driving ourselves, we are driving our own prosperity. We become hedonistic, we don't care. We become alienated from our fellow human person, ultimately alienated from ourselves and alienated from the other and the environment. And I want to tell you, Gys, that one of the most complex problems in moral philosophy, perhaps in philosophy, is the reality of alienation. Because economic systems can create and fuel alienation because they create classes. They create haves and have-nots. Politics can fuel alienation because they create the haves and the have-nots. Those who have power and those who don't have power. So the challenge to each and every one of us is to constantly say, how can we make sure that we don't alienate from ourselves, from our environment, and from the other? How do we build that moral community? And if we have the moral community, which values should actually guide us? Do we have a just society? Do we have a fair society? What does it mean in practical terms? Do we have a sustainable society? Do we have a society that promotes human dignity? Do we have a society that values character? Do we have a society that values custom? Because ethics is really about those two things. If you look at the word ethics, that's what it means. Do we value our values, our customs, our traditions in a positive sense? And do we build character? If we enter into friendships, there are three types of friendships in life. And if we are ethical in our friendships, then we will end up with friendships that will last and relationships that will endure. One friendship we can build on material advantage. That's often the case. We go into a friendship and we say, oh, this is a lovely partner because, we can share, and while the sharing is there, the friendship will last. Another friendship we can build on our knowledge or our professionalism or our careers. I'm a medical doctor, I'm a professor, I'm a managing director, I work in this area, I work in tourism, and therefore I build relationships with others in tourism. That's fine, we have to do that. But the most important relationships that we need to build as a society and as individuals is relationships that are based on character, on the moral character of individuals and societies.
Sure.
And if we build that, Aristotle famously said, to make friends is easy, to build friendships is difficult. The only friendships that really endure are the friendships that are anchored and informed and based on the quality of our character. What kind of people are we? Do we have the emphatic imagination? Do we have the moral imagination? Can we think morally about our practices, our behavior, our actions? Can we build a moral community? The answer is yes, we can. We can do it. We are intrinsically capable of doing that. And through a process of public reasoning and public dialogue and conversation like these, we can learn and we can build together. So if we bring those together, there's hope for Namibia and for the world.
That is so beautifully said. Prof. Andre, is one of the problems or one of the risks not, labels, historic labels? I believe strongly in personal enterprise and the rewards that comes from that. So someone can stick a label on me, oh, you're a real capitalist. I believe, you said it so beautifully, that my humanity is defined by your humanity. Oh, Gys, you're a socialist.
Yes.
And it's become so polarized, all these labels. And because of those labels, we forget about the open part of the canvas.
I agree. You see, the problem with ideology, and let me say there are two problems with ideology. We all have ideologies. We have ideas. We think about ideas, and that's one of the key I's in policy, is the ideology or the ideas. We all have it. Some of us are liberal, others are conservative, others are capitalist, others are socialist. But the problem with ideology, it produces the politics of abstraction. It produces the politics of abstraction. In other words, we don't engage the other person and the ideas of the other person to build something collectively and together. We abstract the person and we say, oh, the problem in South Africa is white monopoly capitalism. You see? Then you abstract the political because we don't engage, So I want to come back to where I started with this idea that politics fundamentally, yes, it's about power. Yes, it's about institutions. Yes, it's about policy. Yes, it's about who gets what, when, and how. It's about all of those things. But politics ultimately is about the art and the practice of associating together and creating a greater, more meaningful whole. And if we think ideologically, or we think in terms of skin color, or in terms of race, or in terms of ethnicity, or in terms of tribe, we are abstracting the other. The other is not like us. The other is either a lesser human or is evil or is bad. We are good, the other is bad. This is acceptable, that is not acceptable. And that creates alienation. So ideology is the politics of abstraction. And we run that risk in Namibia as well. And then when you get populism in the mix, where somebody gets up, like in the US, like Donald Trump and many other examples throughout the world, then the populism basically reinforces the abstraction. So the society becomes more polarized, more divided, more fragmented. So we have to go back to the basics. I know it's not easy, but philosophically, that really is the problem of ideology. That's the problem of race. If we elevate those and we say those are the dividing lines of our society, then we're moving away from the moral community, and we are ultimately abstracting the other. We don't engage the other.
But Prof, I think, in my humble opinion and my limited experience, I think the fact that it's not easy is often a very good sign. It's often sustainability, long-term thinking.
Yes.
The coexistence with, in our case, with natural resources, with animals, with our local communities. It is not easy.
It's not easy.
If it was only the pursuit of profit, it would have been much easier. Much easier.
Sure.
It's short-term gains. So the fact that it's not easy is probably a very good sign, and I think that's part of the experiment. It's never done. I loved how you...
It's never done.
How you've also said that, inequality is often the outcome.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily a negative thing, because that becomes the prompt then
That becomes exactly the motivation to do more. And it's precisely because it's not easy that we need to constantly think about it and act on it. That is the fundamental appeal also of thinking ethically and morally, because it is not easy. It is not easy. But precisely because it is not easy, that gives you the energy, that gives you the space, that creates the opportunity for you to continue engaging with it, precisely because it's not easy. And as it say, hang in there and try to transform and try to transcend. One of my former colleagues, but also a man that taught me a great deal, because my PhD, for example, was on conflict transformation. I've always been interested in ethical questions. And he died this year. He was 92. Johan Galtung from Sweden. He was the father of peace studies. And when I started in the early 1980s, the late 70s, the early 1980s, to study peace studies, it was unheard of in Africa. Now it's an established academic discipline and field. He said that what we need to do is we need to have what he called a model of transcendence. How do we transcend these divides? How do we transcend the alienations that the political and the economic processes create in our societies? Because we must have no illusion about that. Politics divides. Politics is about the strong, not necessarily about the weak. It's about the haves, not necessarily about the have-nots. So we constantly need to work at it. How do we transcend these challenges, which are human challenges? And we can only transcend them by acting morally and by acting humanly, and building our collective humanity and our collective consciousness of belonging and our collective consciousness of a culture of caring, not only for ourselves but for the other and for our environment. There is no other way. And that's why, even if it is very frustrating and if it is very challenging, and sometimes, one is almost desperate, where you say, well, honestly, why bother about moral philosophy? Who listens anyway? People do what they want to do. But it's precisely because people do what they want to do that we have to engage morally. It's precisely because it's not easy that we cannot give up, we cannot surrender. And that's the difference between greatness and people who are just here and who are just, extracting. Because we can be very extractive. Human beings can be hugely extractive. We extract resources. We extract social capital instead of building social capital. Building social capital. Building the moral community, because social capital is a fundamental construct of the moral community. That means building people who care, people who have empathy, people who can engage, people who value dignity, people who are concerned about sustainability and future generations. That's social capital. And that's the heart, that's the rump of the moral community. And that's our job. That's your job. That's my job. That's, what Namibians should be about. That's what businesses should be about.
And I think one of the dangers on that path is that, we have this sometimes this consciousness where we think, if we do this, it will be done. Or if we do this, I read the other day, it's not the pursuit of happiness, it's the happiness of the pursuit.
Exactly.
Exactly. So that we understand that we must constantly pursue these things, but we should never be under the illusion that one day it will be done.
I agree fully. And Schopenhauer, the philosopher, I love Schopenhauer for many reasons. He's complex. I love him, because he really wrote wonderful stuff about art as well. But he said something extraordinarily profound. He said, yes, life will produce pain and life will hurt us. That's inevitable. We'll get hurt in the process. We will get bruised in the process. But the worst form of hurt is when somebody external to yourself comes and hurts you. When somebody imposes his or her will on you. And he said the worst form of hurt and hurting in life is when an external person or state or agent comes and imposes his or her will upon you. And that was the problem, clearly, with colonialism. That was the problem with apartheid. So yes, we will get hurt. Yes, we'll be frustrated. Yes, we sometimes will be exhausted. We will reach the end of it in some senses and say, well, is it really worth it? I've done so much. I've tried so hard. But look. But it's precisely that should motivate us to say, we are not throwing in the towel. We are not going for a TKO. We are fighting this good fight together, collectively, because collectively we know we are capable of making a difference. And if you can make a difference, even in the lives of a few, and your own life, you have lived a meaningful life.
Can I ask you, let's dream a little, if we get that right as a nation, in terms of the times where we live in, and we look down the road 5 or 10 or 15 years, and what is the vision? What does our reality look like? You would be a proud Namibian to say that, wow, we got this right.
I think, that as I said earlier in our conversation, we're at the cusp of, or at the crossroads. We can either go well and we can get it right, or we can fall down the cliff and get it terribly wrong and repeat mistakes that others have made. So the first thing is that the quest for an open conversation, an open dialogue, for taking and learning through that interaction with others that have gone before us. That's very important. And I would say that it's very critical that we engage our African brothers and sisters first and foremost, because if we get it right, that will transform not only Namibia, but for Africa, that will be extremely important. And if we get it right and we build the social capital, the moral community, the heart of the moral community is social capital. Do we have the people? Do we have the knowledge? Do we have the information? Do we have the qualities? Do we have the values, the virtues in our society? Do we have an emphatic imagination? Do we have a moral imagination? Are we capable of caring? Do we have an understanding of what sustainability means? If we get that right, then I think Namibia will become a lone star for Africa and for SADC. And the possibility exists. It's up to us. It's this generation that has to make these social choices, complex as they are. But if we get that right, then I think Namibia will really be a society that one can proudly say, I'm a Namibian, I'm an African. I have a consciousness, I belong. This is the future.
That's so beautiful. Last question from my side, Prof. Andre, I found you always as a positive person. You radiate energy and service, and we quickly discussed it beforehand. I think it's because you don't keep yourself busy with talking about other people, or the highest form of consciousness is probably to go around with ideas.
Yes.
To every day to kick around ideas for the future. And you do that, and I think you're a real servant to our society. But what makes Andre de Pisani happy?
Well, first of all, I think, and this is a difficult question because it's very intimate and it's very personal. I don't like to talk about myself. I do not like to praise myself, because what I am, what I became, was through the interaction with countless of others in many societies. But what will make me truly happy would be that if I can say that I have first of all primed the creativity of people to think, not only how they live, but how they might live. Not only how we live, but how might we live in future. And if I can get individuals to think, because, it's a paradox. Thinking is the most important activity in life, thinking. And then, of course, out of thinking comes action, comes agency. So if you can bring thinking and agency together, you've made a difference. Thinking and agency must come together. They must gel. They must integrate. Now, it's a paradox of us humans that although thinking is the most important, it's the thing that we tend to do the least. It's the thing that we tend to do the least. Not because we are not capable of thinking, but we don't create the time, the space. We don't open up the conversation adequately. We don't open up our hearts. We don't see beauty with our hearts. We see it with our eyes. We don't see the beauty and feel it. We might see it, but we don't feel it. We have to feel the beauty in humanity. We have to feel and experience the beauty in nature. Not only see it, not only come with a camera and take a photograph of an animal or of sausage flay. We must feel that beauty. We must feel that serenity. We must feel that solitude. We must feel the beauty and experience the beauty that lurks in ourselves and in the other. Then, if we can get to that level, that deeper consciousness, and that's why the debate about the environment, as you know very well, is about deep ecology. It's not only about ecological management, it's about deep ecology. How do we balance the social and the biological? How do we balance the environment and the social constructions and those who live on and off the environment? Do we have that inner feeling? When we go in Namibia and when we experience people other than ourselves, are we capable of opening the heart so that we can feel their vibrancy, their dignity, their humanity. Appreciate and value their knowledge and their understanding. If we feel that, then we are human.
There is just no better way.
There's no better way.
To end off also this conversation. And that is so beautiful. I'm so humbled.
Thank
I
you,
really
Gys.
am. For not only your wisdom, but just your presence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It really means a
great pleasure.
lot to us at Gondwana and just as a Namibian to have elders like you. And,
Thank you.
And we take the message and we take it to heart.
Thank you so
From the
much
bottom
indeed.
of my heart, Prof. Andre.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you for the conversation. Remember, one of the truths is a conversational truth. We can't arrive at it if we don't converse.
Beautiful.